So good morning, everybody, to my own second presentation within the Seaplanspace webinar series on maritime spatial planning. Today, I will introduce you to the principles of maritime spatial planning. My name is Schultz-Zehden. I'm Managing Director of SPRO Sustainable Projects, and I have personally been involved in maritime spatial planning ever since its invention, actually. So since 2001, which is now already 20 years ago. So let's see in terms of the principles where the major principles already established in 2008 by the so-called HELCOM-WASAP MSP working group on broad-scale maritime spatial planning. These principles in 2008 have been set well before the adoption of the EU directive. The HELCOM-WASAP MSP working group mentions 10 principles on which any or every maritime spatial planning exercise should be based. So first of all, it should sort of adhere to the concept of sustainable management, apply an ecosystem approach, take a long-term perspective, and set also long-term objectives, but at the same time apply the precautionary principles being based on participation and transparency, as well as high quality data and a good information basis, as well as applying transnational coordination and consultation, but at the same time also ensure that the terrestrial spatial planning is in coherence with the maritime spatial planning. And obviously then to sort of actually apply maritime spatial planning adapted to the characteristics and special conditions of every single area where maritime spatial planning takes place, and not being a one-off exercise, but to be a continuous planning exercise. Let's take a look at the principles which were part and parcel adopted at the EU MSP directive, which was adopted in 2014. So here you see the so-called minimum requirements of maritime spatial planning. Why minimum requirements? Because the EU directive very specifically indicates that maritime spatial planning is in the competence of each coastal member state. But by doing so, that each coastal member state should at least adhere to the requirements you can see here. In fact, every maritime spatial planning exercise should take into account land-sea interactions, should take into account environmental, economic, social, as well as safety aspects, while actually also promoting coherence between MSP itself, as well as and the resulting plans, as well as other processes, such as integrated coastal zone management, ensuring the involvement of stakeholders and organizing the use of best available data, as well as, last but not least, ensuring transboundary cooperation between member states and promote cooperation with third countries. Now taking a look at the comparison between the Baltic principles, which had been adopted much earlier on, 6 years before in 2008, and what then entered into the EU directive. And for that purpose, I have reordered the minimum requirements set in the EU directive in order to allow a better comparison with the Baltic principles. When we look into sustainable management, the first principles, you then see that actually in the EU MSP directive, this has been taken on board 100%, because it actually requires member states to consider the economic, social, and environmental aspects to support sustainable development. But you can see that the directive actually sort of mentions two additional aspects. So it does not only promote sustainable development, but is actually also geared towards promoting growth in the maritime sector. Why is this so? Because in the meantime, the blue growth principle, the blue growth strategy, had been adopted by the European Commission. So what was for a long time blue growth and is now again sort of more reframed towards promoting the blue economy as such, has actually entered also the principles of the EU directive. At the same time, also an additional aspect was included because sustainability is normally translated into economic, social, and environmental principles, while the EU directive is in addition also looking into the safety aspect, which was not part of the Baltic 10 principles. The second principle, the so-called ecosystem approach, is not mentioned in the minimum requirements, but is mentioned under a different paragraph of the EU directive, which points to the objectives of the EU directive. So here, actually, member states are also asked to apply an ecosystem-based approach. The directive is only indirectly, however, calling for the adherence to the precautionary principles, and is also not mentioning sort of the long-term perspectives of the objective setting. So these 2 points are not explicitly mentioned, even though I will explain to you later on that the precautionary principle is actually part and parcel of applying an ecosystem-based approach while doing maritime spatial planning. And then you obviously see that the following 5 points have really been taken on board extensively by the EU directive. So while the Baltic principles are pointing out to participation and transparency, the EU directive is actually pointing to the need to involve stakeholders. The Baltic principles mention the use of high quality data and information bases. This has actually been a little bit sort of changed and adapted in the EU directive. Here, the member states are urged to use the best available data. This is important because, as I will show to you also later on, it mentions, or what it means is that member states can do maritime spatial planning and shall also do maritime spatial planning, even if they do not have all the data available which they would like to have. But, that it should be based on the best available data. In terms of transnational coordination and consultation, the EU directive is even a little bit more specific, as it really calls member states to ensure transboundary cooperation in order to lead to coherence of the maritime spatial plans, as well as asking them to promote cooperation with third countries in accordance to the EU directive. Why is this so? The transnational and the transboundary aspect was actually one of the main underlying reasons why the European Commission took on board maritime spatial planning as a directive, contrary to terrestrial planning, which is actually in the hands of the member states itself, and where there is not such a thing as a common directive. Then we see how the coherence of terrestrial and maritime spatial planning has actually been framed under the EU directive. As it was mentioned, that member states should take into account land-sea interactions and promote coherence with other processes, some of which were also based or are based on EU directives or EU recommendations, such as the recommendation on integrated coastal zone management. And then last but not least, in terms of the planning to take into account the characteristics and special conditions at different areas is framed slightly differently under the EU directive, in the sense that the directive very clearly points out to the competence of member states to determine how the different objectives are reflected and weighted in their maritime spatial plans. The last point from the Baltic Principles, that maritime spatial planning is not a single exercise, is only partially reflected under the EU directive, in the sense that it calls member states to reconsider and revisit their maritime spatial plans every 6 years. So here one could argue that this is, of course, also pointing to continuous planning. So quite amazing that the principles which were once set by member states themselves in the Baltic Sea region have really almost 100% entered later on the EU directive itself. So now have a look into what these different principles really mean in maritime spatial planning. And the best way to show this is to actually guide you through the MSP cycle in itself. And here you see now in the various forms that actually, even though member states or different organizations have drawn their own cycles, all of them are actually very similar in the sense of the basic steps which have to be part of the cycle, and are all based on the Plan Coast cycle, which we had developed together with project partners in 2008 in the framework of the Plan Coast MSP project. So the cycle is always driving you first from an analysis, from assessing the context, drawing up then the objectives, then doing a refinement of the stock take, so looking into the data availability, in order then to sort of go into the planning stage and to really analyze whether there are spatial conflicts and how solutions could be developed for them. In order then to enter into the spatial plan itself, implementing it, and over the course evaluate how the plan is actually sort of adhered to, whether there are changes in the socio-economic as well as natural environment, and therefore whether sort of the context is changing and a new cycle has to start again. And what you see here is that the stakeholder perspective is actually part of each single step. And you also see sort of the requirements we have just talked about in terms of strategies affecting the environment, the socio-economic environment, the availability and quality of data, as well as the institutional legal framework being part of the external environment, which continuously has to be assessed. So this cycle looks here quite different in the so-called step-by-step approach of IOC UNESCO, which is quite well known worldwide. But actually, it's not seen here as a cycle. It's more sort of defined, as it says here, step by step. But actually, if you look into the details here, the steps are very similar to the cycle we have seen before, meaning that you first have to sort of define the objectives, that you then sort of have to analyze the existing conditions as well as future conditions in order then to sort of go into the preparation and the approval of the management plan itself. And here you then see how this was sort of framed by Ireland. I will not go into full details here, but it always goes back to the same kind of steps that you first, the principle of planning, that you first identify the objectives, that you then sort of, analyze the information, that you develop different kinds of options, and that you then sort of come to the ideal plan as sort of accepted by all the stakeholders, and that you then sort of, with the implementation, that you continuously monitor and review the results. And here you see sort of the example from UK, which is, almost the same as the one we have seen early on from the original plan cost MSP cycle. Let's look now into the second principle, which was, as we remember, the application of a so-called ecosystem-based approach. And what you see here is actually sort of the link between the key policies in the frame of an ecosystem-based approach integration. And what is important here to see under the EU context is that you do not suddenly only see the MSP directive appearing, which is about the spatial and temporal delineation of human activities in the sea and the coastal areas, but that you also see the connection to the Maritime Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which was adopted earlier on, and which is the so-called environmental pillar of the integrated maritime policy of the European Commission. So where you essentially see the two pillars coming together under the integrated maritime policy approach. So on one hand, the MSP directive as well, which is dealing with spatial planning, and then Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is all about achieving a good environmental status. And how do they connect? So on one hand, you have to understand the human activities on the marine and coastal ecosystems. At the same time, you have to then sort of identify the pressures which are evolving from these activities on the marine and coastal ecosystem, as well as then sort of look into the distribution and state of the marine and coastal ecosystem, and then sort of look into sort of what kind of ecosystem services and benefits are evolving for society from these different habitats and species. And how is this then connected to the other policies which are linked to the ecosystem-based approach? So basically that you have to carry out strategic environmental assessments for the MSP directive itself. So you have to identify, you have to assess the impact of the MSP itself. And then later on, you have to carry out environmental impact assessments for any kind of specific projects, installations, infrastructures, which are evolving from the use of the given uses identified in the Maritime Spatial Plan. It's of course also connected to the Natura 2000 directive, which calls for marine protected areas, as well as the Water Framework Directive, which is spreading to actually the coastal zone and is actually asking for good environmental status. And last but not least, it's also connected to the concept of integrated coastal zone management, which is not a formal requirement, but is a management framework for coastal areas to be carried out in an informal basis. And here you see sort of the link of the ecosystem-based approach principles and elements with the various MSP steps, or actually also with the MSP directive requirements. I will now not look so much into the steps, but you can see that there is a direct link between the steps, the principles of an ecosystem-based approach, as well as the requirements set in the MSP directive itself. So basically you see from an ecosystem-based approach that in the defining stage, which is always the first in terms of, looking into the data, looking into the stock take, looking into the objectives, that you really have to sort of get the data in order to support the achievement of good environmental status as well as socio-economic and ecological factors. Then in the development stage of the various options, also the ecosystem-based approach asks for a balance between socio-economic and ecological factors, and this is the same, of course, in the directive. When you then look and assess the various options, an ecosystem-based approach is always looking for the impact on ecological integrity, the ecosystem services, as well as the various interaction both for land, sea and cross-border. And this is, of course, reflected in the MSP directive. So here we could go on, but you see that actually these principles are part and parcel of a good MSP process. And this is then actually also visualized very shortly here in this cycle, where you can see that the MSP steps, as we have shown before, going from developing to assessing towards implementation and then follow up, are aligned with the various steps of the EBA principle. And here, if we look into the cycle, as you have seen before, taken from the UK, you see the various where the application of a strategic environmental assessment or an environmental impact assessment for a specific project are coming in. It is part of the MSP directive that maritime spatial plans have to be in line with the SEA directive, which means that countries have to undertake a strategic environmental assessment in parallel to the MSP exercise itself. So you see that here already at an early stage, when there is the plan development, countries have to conduct the strategic environmental assessment and then have to sort of review the strategic environmental assessment once a draft plan is out for public consultation. And once it is adopted, the SEA is then again sort of used as one of the baselines when monitoring the implementation of the Maritime Spatial Plan itself. Countries have actually sort of done this in different ways. In some cases, a strategic environmental assessment is therefore already part of the MSP itself. It's very often then a chapter within the Maritime Spatial Plan or an annex. In some cases, the strategic environmental assessment is done by a different entity, sometimes also outsourced from the MSP authority, in order to allow more neutral approach in view of whether the MSP is really sort of adhering to the strategic environmental assessment. So now let's take a look into one of the other principles, which is mentioned in the Baltic principle set, as well as the minimum requirements as set in the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which is all about stakeholder engagement. So here you see a quite famous visualization of how actually stakeholder engagement sometimes is looking like, that in fact countries or stakeholders are not so much in agreement with each other. So it's important to get stakeholders on board. And as you have seen before, in each cycle, stakeholder engagement is not something which is coming at a given, specific point. No, it's actually something which is necessary throughout the whole process. Why is this so? Because actually stakeholders are really needed in order to assess the context as well as sort of to draw up a joint vision and the overarching objectives of a given plan. And stakeholders are very important later on, also throughout the process, because they very often know much better than any kind of data system on where the valuable space is for their given sector, and obviously are necessary in order to analyze whether there are spatial conflicts, or also to really sort of notice the positive side, where many of the objectives, the beauty of maritime spatial planning is actually coming from the planning exercise itself and not so much from the resulting plan, in that it actually sort of fosters a good coordination and a joint engagement, the first time sort of a roundtable, a listening process between the various stakeholders, leading very often also to not only a dialogue, but actually sort of the creation of synergies between the various sectors involved. What is important to note is that stakeholder engagement is later on not only then important during the planning process itself and its adoption, but is highly important also to actually realize the maritime spatial plan itself. It's very often not the MSP authority then anymore, which is in charge of ensuring that the MSP is adhered to, but it's actually sort of to be taken on board by other various authorities in charge of the maritime space itself, and therefore that they are the ones who have to take on board the decisions and the planning frameworks which are set in the MSP itself. So many countries have actually sort of created a stakeholder group, very often, of course, a similar one to the stakeholder groups engaged during the planning process itself, but a stakeholder group which is sort of meeting perhaps once or twice a year to follow the implementation of the MSP itself, a continuous monitoring of whether the MSP is adhered to, as well as sort of jointly looking into sort of the possibly changing environment in which the MSP is set itself. So a principle, going back to the overarching theme of this webinar, is that not only to engage stakeholders, but actually to engage them throughout the whole process. However, countries are actually sort of differing in the kind of degree to what extent stakeholder involvement is really sort of, to the degree they sort of involve the stakeholders in their maritime spatial planning process. If you see here sort of the ladder of sort of stakeholder involvement, you can see that the lowest level of the stakeholder involvement is actually to keep stakeholders informed, where, however, it's really more or less a one-way communication with stakeholders not really having a say in the input to the plan itself. What countries are often doing is, however, stakeholder consultation, so that the authorities at least gather the views of the stakeholders on the draft plan, however, with not ensuring whether these views are taken on board or not. Then on the medium level, you see that stakeholder involvement, however, really means that stakeholders are actively involved, even though it's still a top-down process. There's then, if you have really stakeholders defined as your partners, here stakeholders and authorities run the process on equal terms. On the last level, it's really about stakeholder decision making, so that actually it's the other way around, that the stakeholders decide on the plan and the authorities are advising. I would say that from my experience that depending on who you frame to be the stakeholder, that countries are sort of, shifting between stakeholder consultation as well as even stakeholders as partners. If you sort of define, let's say, the authorities which are not dedicated MSP authority as sort of your stakeholders. In some countries, you really do have a joint MSP committee, which is set up of the various authorities involved. And here, obviously, you could sort of argue that the authorities are running the process on equal terms, but very often stakeholders being actually also defined as really interest groups, as the coastal inhabitants, as the sectors, the industry itself. And this is very, very rarely the case. Here, I would rather, indicate that most countries are exercising a stakeholder involvement process. Now take a look into the other requirement where in the Baltic case, it was mentioned, that countries should use high quality data, whereas in the EU minimum directives, it's indicated that countries should use best available data. Here you sort of see, what kind of data we are actually talking about, what is needed in order to carry out an MSP process. So obviously you have to think about the boundaries, the legal boundaries, but also the ecosystem boundaries, the physical and biological context, and obviously the human activities itself, because these are the ones which are meant to be guided by the spatial planning process. And here important to see the difference between mapping as well as then later on the planning, because here it's not only important to show what is there out there in the present, since maritime spatial planning is about planning the future. So to look also into the activities which are planned out there, as well as even sometimes relevant former activities. Then to look into what was happening prior to the maritime spatial planning. So to look into what kind of areas are designated, what are sort of regulations for these areas, as well as then looking into the socio-economic context. And last but not least, in terms of objective setting, to do a policy analysis, what are actually the targets set by the countries. So here you see sort of very different maps. Obviously very often it's difficult to sort of set the objectives in a way, but for this we have to go into sort of a vision exercise where it's spatial vision. So this is actually also what is sometimes meant with information. This is of course something which is not really set as sort of fixed data itself. Data is obviously something where you can only deal with what you know from the past, as well as what you may know about planning targets itself. And here you see sort of, how this can look like in a different way. Essentially, what we have seen from an exercise we did in 2016, where we looked into what kind of data maritime spatial planners would like to have. You see sort of a whole list of best available data, essentially that planners would like to know all. This is here about, the various data sets for the different economic human activities, be it, in terms of tourism, where you want to know also about the submarine heritage, the tourism infrastructure, for fishery, what kind of target species, what are the fishing seasons, the meteorology, the wind conditions, as well as then, the social and planning context. So what are the boundaries, etc. Quite often, this kind of data is known, even though I have to say that in terms of planned data, differently to the existing data, it's not so easy to get to these kind of planned plans, because they are very often not in the hand of the MSP authorities. And in some cases, we have even seen, for instance, in the Swedish case, that they do not show the existing submarine cables and pipelines because in the legislation underlining the MSP process in Sweden, this has not been mentioned as being part of the MSP process itself. So it's actually, in the hand of the agency which is in charge of it, which has only been informally been taken into account. Also, we have quite a lot of data gaps when it comes to marine cultural heritage, but also the most important is that we have, still not enough tools to assess the cumulative impacts evolving from these uses. So basically turning all this data into sort of really a good information pool for the maritime spatial planners. So here there is still a lot of work to be done on actually what these different human activities mean for the maritime space itself. And now let's look into the other principle, which is both mentioned in the Baltic as well as the EU directive, which is all about transboundary cooperation, where essentially you see sort of the picture I have shown before about the interests of the various countries, the various stakeholders, in order then hopefully to reach sort of process around the table, something which is, by the way, really done in such way in the processes we have seen now on transboundary cooperation. And why is this such an important principle to actually look into a transboundary approach in maritime spatial planning, whereas it's not such an important principle in terrestrial planning? The answer is quite easy, because we are talking about one ecosystem. We are very often talking about sort of a sea, an ocean, which is of course not sort of adhering to legal country boundaries, but which is sort of driven by one ecosystem. So here, to translate this into the Baltic scenarios, it's really about the principle to take a pan-Baltic thinking, to understand the Baltic Sea as one planning space and one ecosystem. And therefore, to also understand the objectives and the targets jointly for the environment, for energy, transport, and fisheries, because these are sort of the uses which are really transboundary. And thereby sort of to allocate the uses on the basis of a Baltic Sea-wide environmental assessment, as well as a Baltic Sea-wide socio-economic cost-benefit analysis, because the VASA principles is all about transnational cohesion. And cohesion also means that you should not leave one country out, that you should actually take into account also the human needs across the different countries in the Baltic Sea region. And what you see here on the right-hand side is actually showing this principle of spatial connectivity, that on a transnational basis, there is sort of linear infrastructures, there are corridors, be it shipping lines or being transnational energy grids, which are then forming the backbone for the national maritime spatial plans to be adopted. So that you actually see here that it's a kind of subsidiarity principle, that on a very upper level, you really have the pan-Baltic decision-making on the overarching objectives, on the overarching ecosystem, and which are then broken down to sort of the more national and regional level, as well as then for the local level, which is essentially here also shown in the so-called nested approach, that all scales are necessary and have to be linked. You have to have maritime spatial planning actually on all different levels, that you have to take into account the local aspect, but actually sort of that the local aspect is driven by the overarching objectives set at an ecosystem-based approach. And here you see this in a different picture, that actually in terms of this transnational setting, that it's both on multi-level, so across the regional and the transnational level, across the different countries, but then also across the different sectors. And that all these different levels have to come together in order to have a coherent transnational approach. What is important about this transboundary cooperation, which is called for in the EU directive as well as the VASA principles, is to make a distinction between transboundary and cross-border. Transboundary, this means that also Germany is needed to actually have a cooperation and a dialogue, not only with Denmark, Sweden, and Poland, which are directly bordering, but also, here with Lithuania, but also Russia, because we are talking sometimes about, first of all, one ecosystem, but also really transnational infrastructures, transnational lines, which have to be coherent across one ecosystem. At the same time, cross-border then really means a dialogue with the country which is bordering, and where you may come up to so-called hotspot areas where you really need very concrete cross-border planning. Another distinction which has to be made is about the distinction between cooperation and consultation. Cooperation is what we are very successful in the Baltic Sea states, where actually countries within the HELCOM VASAP MSP working group are really working together in the long run. Sometimes also in a project context, in order to, in the long run, identify issues and approaches for transboundary MSP. Whereas the consultation process is really then a step-by-step process to inform and to gather input for a concrete maritime spatial plan. This has been done by all countries across the Baltic Sea region in their processes, which they have now taken on board when they have prepared as well as then adopted their first generation maritime spatial plans. And this was, however, then facilitated by the good cooperation which had been established in the years before, when MSP authorities are continuously coming together, actually twice a year, in order to discuss their processes. And here you see, therefore, the MSP governance framework on a multi-level basis, which is underlying the cooperation. So here you have this ongoing dialogue, whereas then you have decision making at the upper level, but you then have sector strategies across the various sectors, as well as then the practitioners, what we call now the planning forum, where the MSP experts themselves are actually working and exchanging experience on an informal basis. And sometimes where you then have MSP expert groups, which are developing clear recommendations for decision making for the HELCOM VASAP MSP working group, which is really representing the different countries. Here you then see actually the process for consultation, where you remember you have seen this MSP cycle before, and that what was new was that now MSP authorities are actually informing their neighbors at a very early stage about their intention to start the planning process and ask for input, where then other MSP authorities are actually guiding this process for the given country. And so therefore, the given country can actually take already into account what the other countries are thinking, what kind of plans they have. And then once the draft plan is in consultation phase at national level, that they actually also inform the other authorities and that they gather stakeholder input then also from the other countries. So this is very much in contrast to what was the formal process before, where through the strategic environmental assessment, the so-called ESPO convention, countries were formally speaking only asked to inform their neighboring countries about the environmental impacts of a plan, and only so if they were considering that there may be a negative environmental impact to the neighboring country. So this came at a much, much later stage, whereas nowadays countries are really consulting each other at a much, much earlier stage, and therefore do not only consider the environmental aspects, but really sort of open up also much more influence in order to sort of take into account the various also economic aspects as well as also social aspects, and to really create also synergies between the different sectors involved. And all this in the context where actually one always has to consider that countries are operating their maritime spatial planning process, you remember, within the principle that a maritime spatial plan really has to consider the situation in the given space where the MSP is taking place. And this can be quite different because obviously countries have completely different maritime space as well as territorial space available. There are countries which have a huge land territory and actually only little maritime space available, where then this kind of maritime space has to be planned in a different way than countries which have very little territorial space but huge maritime areas available. Obviously also countries differing in their environmental, economic and social conditions, as well as then therefore, the resulting national interests for the given sea basins and, different maritime priorities. But also where there are differences in the governance system, in the planning culture, how planning is actually sort of, undertaken generally in the country, and the different competences of the given MSP authorities, in some countries being placed in the environmental ministry, in some countries being placed in the transport ministry, in some countries being even placed in the Ministry of Finance. To answer here, is one approach possible? No, definitely not. But this does not mean that a transboundary MSP approach is not possible. And where are we in terms of this MSP cooperation? I think that we are currently, even though we in the Baltic states, there has been such kind of long cooperation ongoing actually for really almost more than 20 years across the countries, that only now we are entering perhaps the phase of the fourth stage of cooperation, where countries may sort of define joint objectives and develop concrete actions across them. We are not yet in terms of really only partially in terms of these binding commitments of partners in partnership agreement, but we are entering into this. And all this has been possible only because we have gone through the stage before to know each other, meeting each other, to inform each other, and then to actually sort of really coordinate to create a joint partnership structure in view of this HELCOM-WASAP MSP working group. So this is where, just to show you an example of what is linear infrastructure, where you need transnational cooperation and consultation in the long run, as well as here sort of, how you can actually solve cross-border planning issues when you have a long-term cooperation, because here you see sort of that Poland took on board shipping lanes which were not important for them for the benefit of Lithuania as well as Latvia, in order to ensure that they have a secured access to their ports. And here you actually sort of see these hotspot areas where really joint planning has been taking place between the different countries. But coming now to the end, I would like to stress that there is another set of principles which are not shown in the EU directive nor in the VASA principles, which have, however, been developed in the Baltic Plan project and which have been adhered to by Baltic Sea states ever since. And these are actually these principles. Let's first take the principle of spatial efficiency. A very basic principle when planners are actually looking for the allocation of space to different maritime uses. That actually the underlying principle in MSP is to plan as little as possible and to use the sea space which is available as sparingly as possible. So maximize the use of so-called used space, therefore fostering also possibly co-uses, as we have clearly, what is easiest always to think of is to use the space used of an offshore wind park, which is therefore already, in a sense, an infrastructure, human activity site, in order to use this also in addition for instance, an aquaculture site. Why? Because here, the space is already used, and in order to leave as much space available for future generations, to leave it open, to maintain the freedom of the sea, that you actually establish what we would call industrial areas, as we very well know also from terrestrial. This is the basic principle of spatial efficiency, that you do not look into trying to set each sector on its own, even though at the best site possible, but that you actually also really try to combine these different uses in an optimal way, so that you actually really have this integrated view on the maritime spatial place. And the last principle, in view of the transboundary aspect, is not only the spatial connectivity, so to ensure that obviously, as I have now just shown in terms of with the example of the shipping lane, that you actually ensure the connectivity between the shipping lane from Lithuania and Latvia and the shipping lanes shown in the Polish Maritime Spatial Plan, so that you ensure that these sites are really kept free from other users, so that ships can actually move in the most efficient way. We all know this principle of motorways of the sea, while at the same time ensuring the principle of what we call spatial subsidiarity. I'm sure you all know the keyword subsidiarity from the overarching European Union principle. And this is, of course, also true for maritime spatial planning across the different levels, that spatial challenges should actually, however, be dealt with at the lowest, most appropriate spatial level, meaning that not everything should be guided on a transnational level or national level, but that there is a high involvement from the local level as well as the regional level, because these are actually the levels which are bordering the maritime space, and which should in view of also the stakeholder empowerment, they know best what to do for their regions. But of course, they have to take then into account the objectives and the targets set for the country as such, as well as then the transnational level. And with that, I would like to conclude with the 10th important principle in maritime spatial planning, which is, as you hopefully remember, that maritime spatial planning is a continuous process. So it's an iterative process. It's an ongoing process where basically, you may have adopted your first maritime spatial plan. But when you have adopted it, you're already almost starting with the monitoring of it, with the continuous framing of what has sort of, evolved in the meantime, in order then to sort of really think about sort of, what needs to be changed, what needs to be added, what needs to be revised. We see this already with some countries, given the fact that Germany, for instance, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, started so early on in already 2004 with the adoption of their maritime spatial plan, that they have already been through the cycle twice. So they have already in 2016, so this is already also 5 years ago, adopted their second plan, and are now in the process of starting their third plan. And what we have seen in this iterative process is that with the very first plan, this was sort of the plan which was bringing the sea closer to the stakeholders. It was for the first time that the maritime space was actually shown on a map, that it was clear to stakeholders, hey, there is a lot out there and we should actually raise our voice. In fact, the involvement of stakeholders in the second process has more than quadrupled. So there were many more stakeholders who had showed an interest in the second revision. And I'm sure that this will even be more the case in the third process for the Maritime Spatial Plan, where, of course, now also new aspects have to be taken into account. As we all know, for instance, now the decade of really dealing with climate change and finding solutions, which is much more important in this decade than in the previous decade when the first Maritime Spatial Plan was adopted. So on that note, remember that it's an iterative process, that it's an ongoing exercise. I would like to conclude this webinar on MSP principles. Thank you.